Evening to you all. My name is Rob Havers. I'm the president of the George C. Marshall Foundation, and welcome to this, the first event in the latest sequence of the Marshall Legacy series. And the title of this sequence is Speed and Fury, which examines the role and development of new technology on the conduct and the tactics of warfare. We can think of no better individual to begin this sequence than this evening's speaker, Dr. Dik Daso, former United States Air Force fighter pilot. As part of this sequence, we have also a new exhibition through the doors at the back of the room, From Machine to Man. Please spend some time when you have a moment to explore this wonderful exhibition. During World War I, George C. Marshall, as you all know, was a member of Pershing's AEF to France. During that time, Marshall bore witness to the early employment of aircraft in combat and in the reconnaissance role. Years later, Marshall and Henry Hap Arnold both worked for the War Department in Washington, D.C., and Marshall and Arnold developed a strong professional and personal relationship. And Arnold began to show Marshall the war-winning potential of air power. During World War II, General Arnold, of course, led the Army Air Corps, while Marshall served as Army Chief of Staff. Through Marshall and Arnold's leadership, the Air Force grew into a powerful component of Army operations during World War II, and in 1947 saw the establishment of the independent United States Air Force. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Daso, is a U.S. Air Force Academy graduate, and as I noted, a retired Air Force pilot. He received a PhD from the University of South Carolina and for some 10 years served as the curator of modern military aircraft at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. Today, he teaches 20th century American history at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Daso is the author of a biography on Hap Arnold available in our museum shop. He is currently working on a manuscript for a book about the creation of American air power. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Dik Daso.
Thank you for coming. I've been in this room one other time, and I was speaking to VMI cadets about air power. And I know it's a struggle sometimes with ROTC the way that it is today to get these young men and women off into the wild blue yonder. I taught down here a couple of times. My youngest son is a graduate of VMI, 09. Got married right next door in 2012. I have a fond place in my heart here because I helped teach ROTC while he was here and would bring the cadets up to the Udvar-Hazy Center to give them tours of the Air Museum up there, which was always exciting. So it's great to be back here at VMI. I love it here. Absolutely love it here. But we're going to talk about a few of my favorite people. And by training, I'm a biographer. I teach normally in military circles, World War II, but 20th century technology is really what I love. And when you talk about two individuals that shaped modern America, these are the two that I would pick to talk about. Let's start, and I don't want to lecture you or anything, but let's just start and look at America around the time when these two men were born. Industrialization is just starting in this country in 1870, 80, 90, when Marshall and Arnold were born. It starts in the farms, and everybody knows that before the turn of the century, America is a land of farmers. George Marshall, born out sort of on a farm. Hap Arnold, they're both born in Pennsylvania. He was born outside of Philly. But this is a time of urban migration and actually building cities from the ground up. Learning how to change the way we live in our country by mechanization and all of the processes that happen with industrialization during these years. Electrification is only starting during these years. In fact, it turns out to be cheaper to live in California and pay for electricity than it is to pay for electricity on the East Coast while these folks are young. The telegraph is just turning to the telephone while these two folks are young. Railroads were the king of everything while they were young. There's a national optimism about industrialization, largely borne by and carried on the shoulders of mechanization. The internal combustion engine changes the way we do everything. The way the combine changes how we farm. The way the automobile changes how America does everything. This is the time that Arnold and Marshall grew up. And my question would be, how in the world can these two men, with this young background and their experiences growing up, how can they possibly become the fathers, joint fathers, of American Airpower? How can it happen? Well, let's take a look. We'll see if we can figure it out. We're in a time of manifest destiny, social Darwinism. The Spanish-American War is our first shot at global intervention. These two men are young men, boys almost. The idea of progressivism is spreading as politics are moving to the cities from the rural areas. Theodore Roosevelt is the embodiment of this kind of thought. And at the same time, in the military, the root reforms, LEU Root's reforms for the military are just beginning to take place. Just beginning to take place. Things like Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is becoming new, and the idea of wicked big business is something that these two men will deal with their entire careers in the military. This is the kind of philosophies in our country that they're growing up with. The Great White Fleet, the Panama Canal, the first flight in a Wright brothers airplane by a president, well, former president in 1910. The Rough Rider. You'll see images of both men with their hand on a globe as we go through this presentation. The idea that America was going to spread beyond its borders was something that was new when these men were young. Born in December of 1880 in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, here at VMI, played varsity football. His class rank, George Marshall's class rank, 15 out of 34. Humble. Commissioned into the infantry, and his commission is signed by Theodore Roosevelt. Hap Arnold, born in 1886 in Gladwin, Pennsylvania. West Point graduate. He wasn't actually a real West Point entrant. He ended up going in late to West Point because the guy who was ahead of him got married the day before he entered West Point. And so when they found out at West Point that he was married, they kicked him out and went for the second guy. That was Arnold, who entered, instead of in June, he entered in July. And forever after was known, along with the other handful of late entrants, as Juliets. He played varsity football too. He was known for being on the scrub team. They would practice against the varsity first string and fake like they're going to be the other team, like Brown University or whoever. And he often wrote home about the brutal egg bumps on his head that he suffered blocking against the first string West Point team. His class rank, just a little bit worse than George Marshall's overall, 66 out of 111. My son kicked for the VMI football team for a year too, so there's a little sideline. He also was commissioned into the infantry, although he never really thought that's where he was going to go. He thought he was going to be in the cavalry, because the cavalry, if you weren't going to be an engineer in the Army at this period of time, you wanted to be in the cavalry because they were flashy. They had a big gold stripe on their pants, the roar and thunder of the charge and all that. Future fighter pilots. That's what that was. Playing football in the early 1900s looked like this. And that's why we call it the gridiron. It was squares. Scoring was different. When they started playing football, these two young men, there was no forward pass in football. Not until about 1907 did that start, when Arnold was ready to graduate. Arnold spent most of his time, his senior year at West Point, marching tours. Anybody heard those? That's him on the green. He was called the area bird. He was also in charge of a group. There were two companies at West Point that were pranksters. They were known as the Black Hand. Arnold he's the head of the Black Hand. He's sort of instrumental in grooming the Black Hand. And it's not like it's a secret. This picture's out of the Howitzer, their yearbook. And this is the whole group of troublemakers. This is a big fireworks display that they put on the top of the academic building with their class motto, 1907, never again. Oh, that's enthusiastic. He got caught up there by one of the TAC officers and spent his final 100 days at West Point marching tours. He couldn't even go to the 100 days dance because he was restricted. On the other hand, the first captain, George Marshall, would have most likely been the guy that put Arnold in the newspaper. So we have slightly different personalities with similar backgrounds. I want to spend a minute and talk to you about Hap Arnold's nickname, because in all of the work I've done on Hap Arnold, this is the most misunderstood thing about Hap Arnold that I have come across. And so I'm going to answer this question. What's in a name? Now, when he was a youth at home, he was called Harley, his middle name, Henry Harley Arnold. Everything written about the kids by his mother and father always called him Harley. He was called Harley until he went to West Point. Until he got there, his mother started calling him Sonny because he had a smile that was theoretically smiling. Or Sonny Jim. Now that comes from a particular cartoon character in the early 1900s, and I'll show you this character, but it was the character for a particular kind of breakfast cereal called Sonny Jim. And so because of his insidious, goofy smile, he got that nickname for a while. In fact, his girlfriend and wife would call him Sonny or Sonny Jim for decades before he became known as Hap. When he went to West Point, he had the nickname of Pute, which was from a book called A Real Diary of a Real Boy. And there were three main characters. One of them was Pewter Puritan. And this was a serial that was published at the turn of the century. And he was described as being a hayseed, smoking, barn-burning, snap-crack, popping character. He was always in trouble. Always in trouble. And so Pute was his nickname. One of his buddies had the number 2 character named Beanie, who was also in trouble all the time. He also had another nickname at West Point, Benny. Some say it was because of another more infamous Benny from Revolutionary days at West Point. But in reality, there was an off-post tavern called Benny Havens, where the cadets would sneak to have a tankard of ale and kind of break the mold of being at West Point. And so sometimes he was called Benny. Later on, he was called Billikens. And this was his pet name with his wife, Beetle, or Bee. And I'll show you exactly how that came about, but it's a charm doll that was developed at the late 1800s into the 1900s, and because of his physical appearance, well, you'll see it. This is the breakfast cereal with Jim Dumps. He was the one who was the character, Sonny Jim. It was rumored that if Jim Dumps ate Force breakfast cereal, he would become a Sonny Jim. And that's how he got that nickname, that particular one. That is a Billikens, as it was originally drawn. Now, if you look at the receding hairline that he has here, it oftentimes kind of stuck up in the air. Anyway, this is a letter, how he signed a letter to his wife, B. Yours, the curly hair, smile, goofy chin, and it said Billikens next to his name. For about 3 years, he signed them Billikens. And now it's the mascot for the University of St. Louis, the St. Louis Billikens. Crazy, right? But that's where he got that nickname. Let's talk about Hap for a second, because this is a real revelation for me. One night while I was in the middle of researching the book that I did on him, and some of you are authors out there, raise your hand if you're an author. There's a couple of you out there, I know you are. You'll have this thing that happens in the middle of the night, and you'll go, by gum, I got it. Well, it turns out that in all of the letters, everything, from all of his friends, all of his family, his wife, no one ever called him Hap, ever, until a month after his mother died in 1931. She was the one who instigated the term Sonny Jim. And it really struck him hard when his mother suddenly died in 1931. And there's kind of a month period where between some of his friends from West Point and others, different things are written in the signature block, if you will. But it's about a month after that that all of his letters that he sends to his friends and his family are signed Hap, short for happy. And he never again signed them Son. And that's why. Because his mother was so important and that death made such an impact on him that he changed his nickname. Devastating, but absolutely borne out in all of the letters. It's absolutely amazing. Now let's look at early air power and George Marshall, because a lot of people give General Marshall kind of short shrift for understanding this concept. But I'm here to tell you that in the early 1900s, he was at Leavenworth and heard a speech. And in the speech, the person who was talking was from the Signal Corps or the Signal Division and was talking about some group of guys led by two brothers, the Wright brothers, who had conquered flight and were actually working on flying an airplane. He heard this in the early 1900s, and by 1909, he knew enough to know that when he was visiting Fort Myer, there were going to be trials. The Army was holding flight trials. And it turned out that while he was there, he saw the Army test, which was failed the year before with a crash that killed Thomas Selfridge, but was successful in 1909. And the passenger, the number 2 person, other than Orville Wright in the airplane, was who? No, it wasn't. It wasn't Hap Arnold. I'll show you a picture in a second. It was a guy named Benjamin Falloy. And that evening at Fort Myer, George Marshall shared a room with Benny Falloy. And he heard all about this first flight that went 20 miles at 40 miles an hour. They were up in the air almost an hour. And they earned the contract from the Army. So he got it right from the horse's mouth the day that it happened, that very day at Fort Myer. Then again in 1911, early Mexican border operations, 2 airplanes were assigned to his unit, and he watched one of them crash and then the other one crash. Flying at that time was much more dangerous than being, say, a shoe clerk or something. In 1918, while he was in the AEF overseas, at one point, 2 squadrons of airplanes were under his control. If he needed information, he had the ability to actually order pilots of 2 different squadrons to go fly and do reconnaissance. It's kind of ironic when you think about it that Marshall's impact or his understanding of air power actually started before Hap Arnold's did, as far as the Army goes. That's Benjamin Falloy. That was one of the early flights in the Wright airplane. That's who he roomed with the night in 1909 that he had passed the tests. Now let's talk about Hap Arnold a little bit. In 1911, these are the 3 student pilots who attend the Wright Brothers School in Dayton, Ohio. Navy lieutenant, or a young Navy officer, who goes on to be very significant in naval aviation. Ironically, he was flying with the Wrights because normally naval pilots flew with the Curtiss Company. And these 2 companies, Wright and Curtiss, never really meshed together very well, and we'll see some of that a little bit later. In 1911, that's when Arnold learned how to fly. That was his flight instructor, a guy named Al Welch, who was killed in an airplane the year after he taught Arnold how to fly one, which always signaled something bad to me. Anyway, it was not uncommon for aviators to die early in life during this period of time. So he learned how to fly in 1911, and then later became one of the first instructor pilots, and he opened the College Park Flying School, still the longest consecutive running airfield in America, College Park, Maryland. And he is here with Orville Wright. Never flew with either one of the Wright brothers in the same plane. Only an instructor from the Wright School. Took ground school with them. That's their early -1 instruction manual, for those of you familiar with that kind of thing. Arnold and Milling labeled all the parts of the Wright flyer, so when they had to take it apart, they knew what they were dealing with. That's a beautiful shot of Arnold in an early Wright flyer, about 1912. That's an image, a painting of College Park. But one of the things that started early for Arnold takes place during these 11-12 years, 1911, 1912. Here, the Wright flyer is disassembled as it was designed to fit into a train car so that it could be deployed. This one was being deployed to Savannah, Georgia, where they suffered a huge flood, lost a whole bunch of equipment, and their plane got ruined, so they redeployed back to Maryland after that was over. But it's an interesting thing. There's Arnold right there watching this get loaded into the train car. This idea of logistics is going to be very important for Arnold's career, as it will be for George Marshall's career. It was during this time that Arnold won the first ever Mackey Trophy that the Air Force ever gave out. And he was supposed to fly a triangular course and find a troop concentration, which was a big parachute spread out on the ground. It was only, in the end, it was only him that flew because Tommy Milling was going to compete with him, and he got sick and couldn't fly. So the story of the first Mackey Trophy is kind of anticlimactic, if you will. On November 12th, once deployed to Fort Riley, Kansas, something absolutely terrible happened. You can see the weather looks like outside right now, and this is exactly the case. Passing front, thunderstorms, winds, and on this very flight that he just took off and was fixing to land, he almost died. This is the barograph record of the end of the flight. Now, if you look at this about 250 feet that goes from altitude to ground level without dragging a line anywhere, that happened really quickly, and what ended up happening was he had lost control of an airplane in an accelerated stall, and it started to fall out of the sky until he finally gave it up and let go of the controls. The airplane leveled out about 15 feet above the ground. He landed. He and his passenger, who was a young Lieutenant L.P. Sands, who was taking pictures, got out of the airplane. Sands had no idea that he had almost just died. And Arnold said, "Come on, let's go." And we're walking back to camp. They left the airplane where it landed. And he didn't fly for 4 years after that incident. 4 years. But he did go to the Philippines. And he went there twice. He went there right after he graduated from West Point, but then he went back. And guess who was there when he got there? George Marshall was there. And he got to watch George Marshall in action during exercises in the Philippine Islands. In fact, he and Marshall became friends. Their wives became, Lily became friends with Bee. They went through some very difficult times together because both Bee and Lily were ill during this time period, putting additional stress on their families and making it something that was kind of a bonding factor between these two men and their wives. What he noticed as Marshall was operating in exercises was that he can tell the colonels where to put their regiments, and he can do it in a way that nobody has any hard feelings about the way that he's bossing them around as a captain. And that was one of the great things about Marshall as his career went on. He had a way of convincing people, especially with success, that he had the way to do it. Now we're starting to see these two personalities develop. Arnold's is a lot about logistics for aviation. He understands the system. Marshall is starting to understand command and logistics and how that works, and it's going to continue to develop that way. In the next 10 years or so, Marshall had witnessed early flying, as we talked about. He was being groomed for high command during this period of time, and then World War I, where he becomes a very notable combat planner under John Pershing. Arnold is an experimental pilot. He's becoming totally familiar with everything that the Army does with aviation during this time. One of his assignments was to defend the Panama Canal, to take an aviation unit to the Panama Canal and build a defense there in 1917, which he tried to do. He went down in February and March of 1917 and got no help from the Navy whatsoever. And that stuck in his mind, like, hey, I've been sent here by, the high-ranking guys to build an airfield. And the Navy said, well, no, we need this to dock something, and we need to do this. You need to go back to Washington and try it again. So on the way back to Washington, totally defeated by the Navy, America entered the war, and he would never go back to Panama. He worked instead on the staff of the Defense Department as an industrial troubleshooter in his couple big projects, but one of them was the Liberty engine. He knew all industrial people who had anything to do with the manufacture of the Liberty engine, and the other thing he did was create airfields across the country. And the way that he did it, he would hop into a train at sunset. They would go as far as the train could go until daylight. He would get out of the train, he'd go find a location for an airfield, he'd put a flag in it, get people to build it, and he'd go the next place. And he did that during 1917 and 18 to build airfields across the country for training airmen. Crazy stuff. But he also was involved in some other projects. This is called the Liberty Eagle. Some call it the Kettering Bug. In the official records, it was called FB, Flying Bomb. And Arnold, not directly in charge of the project, but he was in charge of getting the money and the appropriate people to work on this project. He was all about getting a number of these unmanned flying bombs over to the front before the end of World War I. They were tested in Dayton, some unsuccessfully, scaring a lot of general officers out of the grandstands. But he did eventually travel overseas with a Kettering Bug to try to get Pershing to allow them into the war. He got the flu, the 1918 flu, which millions across the planet had. I think the total number was 25 million people across the globe with the flu. And in the military, in the Army, it was more like 55,000 with the flu. And by the time he was well enough to make it to the front lines, the war was over. So no Kettering Bug. But he worked this project, and he worked it with a team of individuals from industry whose names would probably boggle your mind. Henry Ford, the Sperry family, Boss Kettering. Any of these names ring a bell from industry at the time? Those are the people that he's working with on this project. Now, after the war, Arnold and Marshall, kind of go in different directions. but they do have something in common. They suffer bitter personal loss at some point in the interwar years. With the loss of Lily in 1927, General Marshall is permanently affected by that, permanently affected. I've already talked about Arnold's mother, but even more devastating at the time in 1923 was the loss of his young son, 2-year-old son, John Linton, who died of appendicitis suddenly, inexplicably at the time. Absolutely destroyed Arnold for a certain period of time. These kind of personal losses, if you look at this time period, were not all that uncommon. When you look at a lot of the upper echelon families, a lot of them have close family losses to deal with at certain times in their life. Jimmy Doolittle's another one. He lost his son after the Korean War, for example. I mean, there's all kinds of examples of this. But these are things that shape and mold their personalities. There are other things that shape and mold thought processes, and after Arnold got himself busy again, he was stationed in Rockwell Field in California, he started thinking about something that George Marshall had been thinking about as well, and that was how to extend the range of airplanes. And in 1923, he took a couple of lieutenants, who else would you take, right? And put them in this here airplane and told them to go get gas from another airplane. And so these 2 young lieutenants hopped in this airplane, and the mothership dragged a big 40-foot gas tube out the bottom. They hooked it up into the top of the airplane and filled it with gas and oil, because you needed oil then too to make this stuff work. And they did that experiment. They did it a couple of times in 1923. Of course, that didn't catch on right away because, quite frankly, it's crazy scary. So later on, while still in California, another group of airmen in 1929, beginning on January 1st, tried refueling again. This fellow, Arnold, was aware of this, and one of the guys who ordered the project. That is Carl Toohey Spots, who would later become the first chief of the independent United States Air Force, and then their mechanics and airmen that went along with them. They were flying in, not Arnold, but Spots and his crew flew in this, and that is a question mark on the side of the airplane. Why? Because when it took off, they had no idea how long it was going to be up in the air. Because what they were going to do was this mothership was feeding fuel down into the airplane, and they were doing it to kind of bolster publicity for the Air Corps at the time. This is January 1st. It's 1929, so it's okay economically right here. And they are over Pasadena, California. What happens on the 1st of January in Pasadena, California? Every year? The Rose Bowl. And so for 7 days after the Rose Bowl, this airplane flew circles over Pasadena, California. People knew about it, and that was one of the points. And it was very successful. But the idea was to increase range for airplanes. A little bit later on in 1934, it was a really big, important year for the Army Air Corps. Airmail was transferred from a civilian company to the Army. That didn't work out so perfectly, but there were lessons to be learned. This is one of the kinds of airplanes that were flying in early 1934 for the Army. There were no instruments. It was almost impossible to fly at night. By the end of the airmail problem, they were flying a monowing, all-metal, closed cockpit, retractable gear, bomber airplane to help get the mail around the country. It's a kind of a transitional year from this to this. That's pretty remarkable, and this is what we're going to start to see. From these years forward, aviation technology is going to start to do crazy things. Speed, altitude, duration, how much they can carry. All these kind of technological changes are going to be happening, and the two people who are going to be watching it and making it happen are Arnold and Marshall. Arnold took 10 of these B-10 airplanes and flew an 18,000-mile round-trip flight from Washington to Alaska and back that year, which included all of the logistics for all of the fuel, all of the oil, all of the food, all of the landing fields. This is the stuff that Arnold is thinking about, the logistics of air power. Anybody can fly one of these, but not everybody can do the hard part, the logistical part. How many of you have heard the story of George Marshall's announcement, or how he found out he was going to be the Chief of Staff of the Army? Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. Arnold and Marshall and Spotts are flying on one of Arnold's airplanes in California to inspect an set of industrial sites. Spotts is recounting this story in one of his interviews done here at VMI. Somewhere over the Mississippi River, the airplane they're in receives a Morse code signal from Bowling Field that announces that George Marshall is going to be the next Chief of Staff of the United States Army. And he's, of course, excited. And what he does is also Admiral Stark had just found out that he was going to be the Chief of the Navy, the CNO. And so Marshall asks for the airplane communications radio operator to send a congratulatory message back to Bowling Field and one to Admiral Stark. And so Marshall sends this greeting, and it is translated by a young airman at Bowling Field as to Admiral Stork, which somebody thought was code for bird. Admiral Byrd was at the South Pole, and they transmitted another message to the South Pole congratulating him on being the next CNO. Well, eventually that got fixed. The story you heard? Yes, or something new? Good. And that's Spotts who recounted that story after the war. Where these two really come to the fore and where they really are the most impressive is during the years of expansion that take place during and prior to World War II. The Army, from 250,000 to 12 million plus soldiers. The Army Air Forces, from way less than that, about 2,500 airmen to 2.4 million in a period from 39 to 44. From 2,500 airplanes to 300,000 airplanes. The United States Air Force today has less than 5,600 planes. Today's Air Force. Do you think we will ever see 300,000 planes in our ever again? These men did things during these years that no person will ever do again. And they did it by themselves, for the most part. And it was kind of funny because George Marshall never liked Arnold's staff officers. He thought they were too immature. All they were looking for was promotions. He didn't like them very much, and Arnold handled the criticism of his staff very well. And he worked with them to try to improve the staff. Marshall was a meticulous staff officer. Arnold was not so much. Arnold thought, and he largely worked on the expansion of the Air Forces by himself with a very small group of his captains. He always thought that this expansion and all the work he put into it is what killed him in the end. You may or may not know, but he suffered heart ailments throughout World War II that at times kept him from going to major conferences, kept him from participating in other things near the end of the war, and it kept him from going to Orville Wright's funeral before he eventually died of a heart attack in 1950. The key here is that both of these men are, through a career of experiences, specifically trained for the kind of command activity that they are going to be in charge of. And the fact that Marshall did everything he could to allow Arnold free sway with the Air Forces is a huge factor on Marshall's side. he understood what Arnold brought to the table, understanding aviation technology, the buildup of aviation. He had another 10 million things to worry about. Arnold had 2.4 million. Brilliant teamwork. There were the politics part of it. Robert Lovett. Getting time with the president was always pretty challenging. But they both had these times. They both had times with politicos. They all had command decisions to make. From planning to, this is Doolittle's Medal of Honor award in the Oval Office after the Doolittle raid. There were exactly, other than the photographer, 5 people in the office. Arnold, Marshall, and Ms. Doolittle, and Jimmy. Well, these other two. He had a fire people that he liked, Possum Hansel. He fired him from command in the Pacific and put, who's that? Bombs away LeMay, right? Kurt LeMay in his place, and moved perhaps his most trusted lieutenant, Ira Aker, from a great job commanding 8th Air Force down into the Mediterranean. Everybody else thought he got fired, but the reason he moved him was because he needed a 3-star general to balance out the RAF command structure in the Mediterranean, and Aker was the only one he could use. He didn't fire him, he promoted him. Aker didn't think so. He wanted to command 8th Air Force. Who wouldn't? Well, Doolittle got the job. Moreover, Arnold had ties with industry that perhaps no other general officer had during the war. Here he's in his staff car with Henry Ford. Henry Ford built not only B-24s, but engines galore, a number of different projects. He spent hours and hours going through factories, encouraging the workers to do their best and do what they could for the war effort. And he had the technological side. This is Larry Bell. That's Mr. Knudsen, who came in from industry, I think it was GE, and ran some of the business logistics for the Army Air Forces. He gave Larry Bell a motor that he had basically borrowed from the RAF. Peter Portal gave him the first jet that the RAF had built, and he brought it back and gave it to Larry Bell and said, build me a jet airplane. And in Schenectady, New York, he did that. The funny part was the people who were building the airframe had no idea what was going inside of it. It was so secret. Command science and technology, and this is one of the ones that I don't think General Marshall ever understood. He knew it was important, but he had not grown up in his career in the kind of technological advance that Arnold had. From the very beginning, the very first airplane, Arnold witnessed the technological change that the Army Air Forces saw all the way through, for him, almost to the Korean War. He sat on the NACA board. Yeah, that's him right there. Some of the other characters. Vannevar Bush, George Lewis, Hunsucker. That's Orville Wright. Lucky Lindy. These are some pretty high-power aviation-related names. Arnold knew what the leading edge of aviation was, and that's why he sat on this board. If he had problems with his airplanes, he could come to these giant brains and say, look, we've got icing problems above 18,000 feet in my B-17s. Fix it. And they would, or they would try to. Marshall asked Arnold right after he became, he started to, they were both deputy chiefs at the time, what on earth are you doing with people like this? And he called them all the long-haired men. Well, you can see why. That's Theodore von Karman. He would become the leading scientist for the Army Air Forces long before there was a World War II. He would be involved with Arnold from the 1930s, doing things like thinking about wind tunnels and other things. Some of the projects, now hold on to your helmet, because some of these things that Arnold and aviation did together in World War II will absolutely boggle your mind. This is the XP-59, America's first jet airplane. It flew in 1942 and nobody knew about it in this country for a year. After it happened, it was that classified. that Ben Chidlaw, who was the first Army officer to fly it, was not allowed to tell his wife what he was doing, and it wasn't until 3 years after he flew the airplane that an actual story in a newspaper came out revealing that airplane, part built in Schenectady, part in different places in New York, and everybody thought the Manhattan Project was secret. And that's what it looked like. So, back to refueling. Arnold never gives up on aerial refueling because it is absolutely vital to get planes that can fly further than 2,500 miles so targets far away can be attacked, so larger loads can be carried, all this kind of thing. So they come up with this. In the back of a B-17, they cut out a little slot in the back and they build this little tube into which a young airman gets in there with something that looks like a harpoon with a grappling hook on the end of it. Crazy, you say. Until this B-24 gasoline-filled airplane takes off with a long hose, and this young airman gets in the tail of the B-17, and they fly closer and closer to each other, and he shoots the grappling hook from here to here, and pulls that tube into the back of the B-17 bomber. Aerial refueling in World War II. Never caught on for some reason, but the idea was there. It was the idea of refueling that was so important. Experiments were done. This is crazy. Precision-guided unmanned weapons. We talked about the Kettering bug already. And in the early 1940s, Arnold did it again. He went back to the team that had built this. He went and he added the Cessna company and tried to get them to take one of their little Cessna airplanes and turn it into a flying bomb. That didn't work. So they came up with a project called Aphrodite. And Aphrodite had two different phases. It had these little gliding bombs that were basically 1,000-pound bombs with wings strapped on the top. And they would drop off of the B-17 at the command of the bombardier, who would aim to glide them 1 mile forward for 1,000 feet up in the air. And that's how they would fly at 18,000 feet, and they could stand off 10 miles. Standoff targeting. Arnold didn't want these airplanes flying through flak belts. He wanted these bombs to attack the targets without risking his airmen. Very forethoughtful in an age where precision is not what we know it as today. It gets crazier, though, because the other phase of Aphrodite is this one. That is a pilot. This is a B-17. And that is an open cockpit in the B-17. Right directly below the pilot is another hole cut in the B-17 where the bombardier sits. And when they are ready to arm this bomb, which, oh, by the way, it has 25,000 pounds of TNT in the airplane. When they arm the weapon, they put parachutes on and they jump out the bottom. And this airplane is controlled by radio from a ship 5 miles behind it. And crashed into a submarine pen in northern France. 11, count them, 11 times they did this. They weren't all successful. One of the Kennedy brothers was killed when one of these airplanes blew up in midair after the bombardier touched the wires together. Boom. And that's how Joe Sr. died, or Joe Jr. died. This version of the GB weapon, there were 1 through 8. This version has a television camera on it. And when guided by a radio-controlled mothership after the weapon is released, it looked like this. Now, if I would have showed you this and said, this is targeting from the Gulf War, you'd have gone, okay. This happened in 1943 and 44. 43 and 44. That's what Arnold was doing with the long-haired guys. He was coming up with this crazy stuff to help his Air Force. But in the end, it was all of that stuff, the intrepid airmen and their mission to gain and maintain air supremacy over the beaches at Normandy. That was the ultimate result of air power and Arnold being allowed to do it like he wanted to, and Marshall trusting him to do it. This is the 12th of June, and all of the chiefs are headed to the beach after the D-Day landings. Marshall, up until Overlord, had been very, very concerned about combined operations and joint operations between the ground forces and the air forces. He said that during Overlord, we possessed the means to give proper application of air power in combined operations, and in the end was why D-Day was successful. On the day that these folks stood on the beaches at Normandy, by the way, I don't think you'd ever see all the chiefs of staff of anything even standing this close to each other in the Pentagon anymore. This is on the beach. There's no enemy airplanes there. There were like 26 enemy sorties the whole day because the Allies had air supremacy over the beach. Now, Marshall understood this, and he understood why Arnold was so important as a right-hand man. And it's kind of funny. I don't know if you've been looking at the pictures very closely, but in every single picture except one that you haven't seen yet, Arnold is at Marshall's right hand. Always literally at the right hand of Marshall. Marshall understood that the average military person could understand infantry, cavalry, even tanks, how to use them in combat, but this is key. When it comes to aviation, the development had progressed with such leaps and bounds, such unbelievable advances in speed and distance, in altitude and in size, that it staggered the imagination. The very nature of air development made it difficult to forecast a solution in military preparedness. He got it. He understood that. He didn't understand it all, but Arnold did. And he let him run with it. He let him run with it to the tune of the B-29, the most technologically advanced piece of aviation built during World War II, other than the atomic bomb. This piece of equipment was untouchable then. Pressurized, remote-controlled guns of sorts, huge capacity, long range, long distance. Amazing stuff. Shortly after the successes at D-Day, Marshall sent this message to Arnold. The Army Air Forces should now assume responsibility for research, development, and development procurement. Those are marching orders. And so Arnold took those and he started almost immediately, the next month, by getting Theodore von Karman, the most renowned aeronautical scientist in America, to join the Army Air Forces as the scientific and technical advisor. And he would do this until 1963. Arnold served on the Scientific Advisory Board in different functions until he died in 1963. What Arnold wanted him to do was to come to the Pentagon, bring a bunch of your buddies, and we're going to work out a blueprint for research for the next 20, 30, even 50 years. Go. And the Scientific Advisory Group was born. The Air Force still has the Scientific Advisory Board. It's a little bit larger than these 33 guys right here. Sometimes 400 are present, but that just gives you an idea of how much technological change has happened over these decades since the end of World War II. That's the first chief scientist. He's an interesting guy. He was in the Hungarian army during World War I, and he built a reconnaissance helicopter. How'd you like to be that big in this helicopter? No, I don't think so. But this is what he worked on, fluid dynamics. Fluid dynamics, how things work as they go around structures. He was perfect for aviation. And that was his whole career, was about fluid dynamics. This is the guy, the scientist, that solved the collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge and then helped to rebuild it by fluid dynamics. That's the kind of guy. Now, for my money, when I think of how do you come up with this kind of theory, I think maybe one of his contemporaries had a better idea. A guy named Vincent. Starry Night, natural phenomenon looks a lot like, well, anyway. People think of things in different ways. Arnold only really got to meet Kármán because in World War I, he and Robert Millikan, who was the president at Caltech, met because Millikan was the head of research and science for aviation as a de facto civilian. And Arnold met him there. And for the rest of their lives, they were involved at Caltech, and that's how Kármán came on board in right around 1930. The Kármán Fluid Dynamics Lab still exists at Caltech. It's awesome. One of the projects that his group was directly involved with was the first jet-assisted takeoff system. And it's actually Rado with Jado. This is Kármán right here. And in this particular picture, what he's doing, they put initially 6 rockets on an air coupe and watched it do that. That was the first Jado takeoff. What Kármán was figuring out here was how to make that airplane take off without a propeller. He calculated they needed 12 of these Jado rockets. They mounted 12 Jado rockets on the air coupe. This guy here was the test pilot, Homer Boucher, who was not very happy about it, who got into the cockpit of the air coupe without a propeller. They drove a deuce and a half up in front because it had to be rolling for this to work. He held a rope that was tied to the deuce and a half. They started towing him down the runway, and when he hit 20 knots, he let go of the rope, he hit the ignition system, and up he went. First jet flight, rocket-powered flight in the country happened out there at Muroc. Crazy stuff. I want to show you, I'm going to assume this is going to work. I want to show you a short clip because it's important that you hear Arnold's voice. Most of you probably have not. Everybody knows what George Marshall sounds like. We'll try it. If it doesn't work, I'll have to do my impression. Okay, well, anyway, what it sounds like. You ready for this?
I think that you people here deserve a little bit of background on this thing that we call air power.
That's exactly what he sounded. Trust me on this one. Does it not? Didn't it not? See, now I can't. Now I'm stuck. All right. What happened after these marching orders and getting together these 31 giant brains is they all hopped on transport planes and went to Germany and followed the invading armies and invaded all of the German factories. In those factories, they found all kinds of magic stuff, including information on the swept-back wing, high-speed flight. All of this went into a science and technology report that was given to Arnold. And if you ever read the war reports of the commanding generals for the last 2.5 years of the war, what is in the Air Division report from Arnold under science and technology comes exactly from Kármán's report that looked like this. 33 volumes of this written by some of the leading scientists in the country. Only 100 of these were printed. They were not distributed like things are today. And so a lot of the things in these volumes nobody knew anything about 10 years after it was over. Crazy stuff. And so while Kármán and Arnold within Air Force circles get most of the credit for being the architects of air supremacy, what they don't know is that there was an instigating force behind it. Somebody who got there first in the early 1900s and knew what he didn't know and let Arnold run with it. He gave him the authority to do it, and now we had an independent Air Force, and we had a great force during World War II. Hap wrote in his biography near the end, it was hard to think how there could have been an American Air Force without George C. Marshall. And he was right. He was absolutely right. But I want to leave you with something that I found as you try to pick out certain things that they say about their own leadership. And if you look at these, a lot of them are the same, completely independently out there at different times. But for Arnold, basic knowledge, your tools, professional knowledge, hard work, unrelenting hard work, physical strength, vision that converts dreams into reality. Unbelievable. The golden rule, the simplest and best code of ethics, character, integrity, unselfish, devoted purpose. All of these kind of characteristics are the ones that, if we were all a younger audience, I would be pointing to the cadets here and going, see, this is the stuff that the real leaders found to be important. And it still applies to all of us. And as we look back on some of these things, we go, you know, that's worked for me in the past. Or I don't have that. Maybe that's why I wasn't successful at what I did. I think of that a lot, personally. Of course, they became household names. They were during the war, some even a little bit before the war, and certainly after. George Marshall, of course, went on to a monstrous civilian career. Arnold died in 1950. Marshall was a pallbearer at his funeral. They both have statues. This one may be familiar to some of you. This one is familiar to me because this is the Air Force Academy that did not exist while he was alive. If you were looking to the future and you were talking about Hap Arnold, if you had to separate Marshall and Arnold, the way that you would do it is you'd say, Arnold saw the future, Marshall made it happen. Thank you very much for having me. If you have questions, we'll do a little question and answer. If not, we'll go up and eat and drink and be merry, and I'll talk to you today. Anything? Go ahead, sir.
Yes. You mentioned earlier in your slide presentation about Marshall, and he was a graduate of VMI, correct?
Correct.
Now, you mentioned West Point. Was that was Hap?
That was
where he
Arnold.
graduated from?
Yeah, he graduated in 1907, and Marshall was 1901. So,
You might have mentioned this and I missed it, but can you say a little bit more about their personal relationship? Did they spend much time together? Did they go out and have a beer? How did the two of them?
that's a really good question. And what I wanted to say after I went through Hap's nicknames was, I don't really see a lot of evidence that General Marshall had a commonly used nickname. In fact, there's a really famous story that he didn't even like it when FDR called him George. So he was a lot more formal as that went. Their relationship on duty was certainly much like that, but they also, when they lived near each other at Fort Myer, would get out in the backyard and watch shoot-'em-up cowboy movies on a screen between their houses at Fort Myer. So they did have a personal relationship, but Marshall and Arnold were fundamentally different personalities. Arnold was a prankster. I mean, even his kids tell stories of him putting on a beard and coming out of a cigar at Halloween and trying to scare little kids. I mean, crazy stuff. I don't think General Marshall would have done that. In fact, you can tell I'm uncomfortable saying George in this environment. Nobody called him that out loud in public. It was always General or something else. Yeah. Does that answer that?
Yes, that's good.
And their personalities are, it's a great thing, though, how they all mesh together to do these things that they did. And one of the great quotes from Carl Spaatz is, aviators were a different breed of cat. And they are, trust me. Sir?
Marshall was famous for standing up for people. And I understand that maybe FDR didn't think that much of Arnold, but Marshall stood up for him.
Initially, there was somebody tried to torpedo Arnold's nomination to be the chief. It was actually crushed by a lot of different people. Somebody had leaked a story that he was a drunk, which was not true at all. Marshall knew that. So did the chief of the Air Corps at the time, and people had known before he killed himself in an airplane crash that that wasn't Arnold. So that part of it, no, he stuck up for all. Marshall stuck up for everybody he believed was doing their job. Arnold did the same thing. But remember, this is a different time. These guys, when they were fighting in World War II, friendship came behind command. And Arnold was famous for firing his friends because they were not performing. And the story, probably my favorite one, is when he put Curtis LeMay in charge of bombing in the Pacific with the B-29s. He had fired his friend Haywood Hansel. And LeMay came in and for the first 2 months was doing the exact same thing that Hansel was doing. High altitude bombing, and of course with the B-29 and the Norden bomb site, the winds were so strong during that season in the Pacific, the Norden bomb site couldn't compensate for the winds, 200 knots. The Norden bomb site only had 75 knots. So Arnold sent LeMay a letter that said, look, if you can't get this squared away and start doing some damage, I'll bring in somebody who can. And the week after that, he bombed Tokyo from low altitude at night with incendiary bombs and burned out 16 square miles of the city. Arnold was happy. So it's not that LeMay was a brilliant guy. I mean, the first raid on Tokyo was a low altitude firebombing raid that Doolittle flew. It's not that it was new, it's just he got threatened into doing it, which is why Arnold was such a good commander. Sir?
Was the Navy following the technology at the same time, or were these guys sharing it with the Navy?
No. Oh, share it with the Navy? No, sometimes. If you were associated like with the NACA board, there was a naval representative, they knew that, but the airplanes that the Navy needed were different than what the Air Forces needed. So they had different procurement, they had different missions, and in fact, roles and missions is going to be the problem after World War II is over, and one of the reasons that we have an independent Air Force, because the Army Air Forces could strategically bomb people, the Navy could not. And so the independent Air Force's mission was strategic bombardment, and that turned into all of the things that go along with long-range, big bombers, ICBMs, that type of thing. So,
early in your talk, you mentioned the group that styled themselves the Black Hand, and that was not original with them.
probably not.
Well, they're the precursor to the Mafia, Cosa Nostra, during that exact same time, first decade of the 20th century,
Could very well be. Sure.
were known as the Black Hand.
Yeah, you're right.
And were very active in New York City, which was not too far from.
That's a very good one. And it goes along with, you know, the nickname stories and all the other things that are happening in that period of time. They freely borrowed, copyrights not extended. Sir?
Can you comment on what Marshall's relationship with Frank Andrews was? And
Sure.
how he fits into this equation?
Frank Andrews, many of you know that Frank Andrews was actually on the hook to become the commander for the D-Day operations ahead of Eisenhower. Unfortunately, he crashed his B-24 into a mountain and killed himself in 1943. He had been the guy, like I told you that story in 1939 when they were flying to do inspection tours, and that's when he found out he was going to be chief, Marshall did. Before that, he would fly those inspection tours with Andy Andrews. And so some of his early, more modern air power education came from Andy Andrews and his staff. And then Arnold hopped on that train, but he was probably more comfortable with Arnold because of his longtime personal relationship with him. But Andrews played a significant role, certainly. Sure.
All of your photos showed airplanes with wheels strictly for land. Did you, prior to World War I, did you see anything of the flying boats or the Curtiss waterborne?
Oh, sure. I mean, well, and then I mentioned briefly that the relationship between the Wrights and Curtiss was not amicable.
Yeah.
And largely because the Army preferred Wright products, the Navy preferred Curtiss products, i.e. flying boats.
Yeah.
And the early flying boats were going to be used by early naval aviators, and they looked exactly like boats because the people who built the pontoons were boat makers. That's what they knew. That's how they did
That's
it.
what my dad flew.
An old Curtiss boat plane.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Army didn't, and this is all part of a whole nother great lecture that I could give you on Army-Navy rivalry. Of course, VMI doesn't have any rivalries.
And with that, Dr. Daso, thank you very much indeed. Indispensable for every library, the words of George C. Marshall.
Awesome. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Our pleasure to have you here. As always, if you're a friend of the Marshall Foundation, your support enables us to bring great speakers like Dr. Daso here. If you're not a friend of the Marshall Foundation, please consider joining the Marshall Foundation and join us on June 2nd when we will have Dr. John Mars, graduate of Washington and Lee from the United States Army Historical Center, who will talk here about Marshall and the Fort Benning Revolution. So another great speaker in the Marshall Legacy series. Please join us for the reception upstairs and a chance to talk to Dr. Daso again. And if you have a moment to look through the exhibition, please do so. And one thing in particular to look at, when we were talking initially about what this exhibition should have, what items from the Marshall Foundation collection should be displayed, our curator said to me, well, you know we have Hap Arnold's wallet, don't you? To which I said, I had no idea. When Hap Arnold died in 1950, his wife sent his wallet to Forrest Pope, complete with every membership card, his driving license, his social security card, all inside it. Been sitting in the Marshall Foundation all this time. In one of those display cases, you can see Hap Arnold's wallet and all his cards laid out.
It's fabulous.
It is a wonderful insight into the man. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming this evening. It's a great pleasure to have you as always, Dr. Daso. Thank you once again, and join us upstairs. Thank you.